Hi everybody, and welcome back to INTR 101, College Success Strategies. So today we're going to be talking about presentation management, so it might get a little meta. So when we talk about presentation management, I want to start with a quick question, which is, what makes a good presentation? So take a second to reflect on any presentations that you've been to or been a part of that you felt went really well, and what were some of the things that made them so great. All right, so what we're going to do is start with an example of what not to do. So without further ado, this is an example of a terrible presentation. Chemtrails. Wake up, sheep. Chemtrails, they exist. Do they exist? We don't know. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I totally muted myself. I don't know what happened there. Let me like play around. Oh God, now my video is gone. Oh no, oh gosh. Oh, okay, and we're back, All right, so we're gonna kind of pop through here. Chemtrails have nothing to do with jet engine combustions, although I know you think that they totally do, but they totally don't. They're laid out in a grid-like pattern, which is like crazy. So like chemtrails, just you can read, like, they're not contrails. They're left by planes flying at lower elevations. They're just like, sorry, 1 minute. They're restricted by the FAA. Anyway, you get the picture. So why chemtrails? Well, short answer, total control of the population. Just like the government's use of fluoride and aspartame, their ultimate goal is to subdue citizens. Long-term effects include slower motor function, increased apathy, lower IQs, skin aging, Crohn's and Addison's disease, sterility for population control. So one thing that some people say are like, you know, chemtrails aren't really real. So deniers argue that chemtrails, you know, they can't distinguish between the general public and the elite, but that's wrong, because like the Illuminati have obviously provide protection for their members, you know, if they can pay for it. So yeah, there's all different things that they use, but that's the big one. So to protect yourself, you know, stay indoors. Cilantro totally helps. These things, great, super helpful. That thing as well. Great, thank you, bye. Okay, so thanks for indulging me. I really enjoy making terrible presentations. So let's take a second and think about what was wrong with that presentation, because there were lots of things. So number one is all of my tech issues, right? I had my camera off, I had my camera facing the top of my head, I was muted for a little while. All of these things really take away from the presentation and make it not great. Next, the design was terrible. I had red writing on yellow background, which is super hard to read. The fonts kept constantly changing. All of the slide backgrounds were different. Some other things, I had way too many transitions and animations on those slides. They aren't really helpful. They don't bring a lot to the presentation. There were a ton of pictures there that I never really explained. I just kind of ignored them. As far as how I presented, I rambled a lot. There were a couple of slides that I read just like verbatim without kind of adding any material to them. So a lot of really terrible things about that presentation. So let's talk about how we can improve it. So there's a lot of different ways. Number one, when we're presenting, we want to make sure that we're presenting with confidence, and that starts with our presentation, like the actual thing. So we want to keep it clean and legible. We want to check for any sort of grammatical errors. You probably saw a bunch of those sprinkled throughout. We want to make sure that on the slides, we're providing the essential information and avoiding any distractions. So when I talk about providing the essential information, when you're in person, it's a lot easier to like not have a ton of writing on the slides. Occasionally when you're giving a presentation online, you do need to include a little extra information, and that's just in case folks have any trouble hearing you or anything happens where you aren't able to discuss the presentation as thoroughly. Now, when it comes to distractions, I always talk to folks about pre-made slide backgrounds. So now there are a lot of like pre-made slide backgrounds that are quite nice and very minimal, and those are totally fine. But you want to be wary of any of them that are really overwhelming, have a lot of extra like bits and bobs on them, way too many colors or distracting elements. Like those things just aren't helpful and don't really add anything to the presentation. So looking for something minimal with 1 or 2 accent colors is ideal. You'll notice in all of the presentations that I give, I use the same slide backgrounds, which are university provided ones. So the U of I went through and made a bunch of slide backgrounds that fit like university branding. So I tend to use those just because it works well in the office that I'm in. If your department has anything like that, or you want to use the U of I ones, that's always a great option. Now, there are some instances where using something a bit more dramatic or with a bit more flair makes a lot of sense. So if you're in a really creative class, I'm thinking anything within like the art and architecture program or, you know, fine arts and things like that, there may be a bit more of an artistic edge to those presentations, and it makes sense for the setting and context. So just taking those things into consideration whenever you're making a presentation. Next, providing a strong presentation takes practice, right? This doesn't happen overnight. All of the presentations that I give for work, I make sure that I do a lot of practice rounds so that I really firmly understand all of the information that I'm giving to people. So you want to know your presentation and know your information. So knowing the presentation means understanding the requirements of that presentation. Is there a time limit involved? Is there a certain format that I have to follow? Is there a goal that I'm aiming for? Checking off all of those questions and making sure that they're incorporated into your presentation is ideal. When you know the information, that means making sure that if you're bringing up any terms or anything like that, you would be able to answer questions about those things and talk about it in a very knowledgeable way. So the other thing that I include in here is be knowledgeable in the technologies that you're using for the presentation. So when I was giving that really awful one, I had muted myself for a bit. And that's a really common thing that happens on Zoom all the time, no matter how long we've been using it. So make sure that you know and you're comfortable with whatever online like software you're using if you're presenting online. If you're presenting in person, make sure you also understand all of those sides. You know, like you may need to bring an HDMI cable. You may need to know how to like upload your slides from a USB or from your email. And it may seem silly to highlight that, but it is a really important thing to remember. And within that, you want to make sure that you're creating safeguards for yourself. So let's say you're giving a presentation in person, bring it on a thumb drive, but also email it to yourself. So, you know, sometimes thumb drives just don't want to work. So make sure that you have a really good backup in order to still access and present that material. So some general tips, come prepared, whatever that looks like to you. Whether it's having note cards, an outline, or the slides printed out for yourself, make sure you have the things you need in order to present. And then while you're presenting, take on the role of an orator. So that means speak clearly, face your audience, make eye contact, and then dress appropriately. So when you're making eye contact, just as a note over Zoom, it's important to look at the camera and not at your picture. So oftentimes we turn into the narcissist trap where we want to stare at our reflection in the pool. And that's great, but it then doesn't look like you're actually speaking to the audience. So shifting and staring at your camera instead helps with that feeling. Now, when I talk about dressing appropriately, it can get a little sticky, right? Because our professional dress wear tends to be super focused on like old white dudes. It's very, very classist and it's very sexist in a lot of ways and kind of racist too. So when we think about dressing appropriately, just consider whatever like put together feels like for you, something that you feel confident in, something that looks nice to you and presentable to you. If you're presenting over Zoom, you know, make sure that from the waist up, you'll look like you got it together. And then my final note, which I've bolded and made larger, is don't do slide karaoke. So it's a little harder to tell slide karaoke over Zoom, but when you're in person, that means staring straight at the slides, not looking at your audience, and reading word for word what's on them. And this really disconnects people from your presentation. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence that you know the material and that you've practiced it really well. And it doesn't add anything to the presentation. So everyone can stare at your slides and read them. What you're there to do is really impart the information in a creative and informative way that adds to the material that's up on the screen. So keep that in mind. You want to present with confidence. So be prepared to answer questions afterwards about the material. Make sure you're actively listening and using the questions that you're asked to actually frame your response. Treat every question with respect and make sure to thank the audience for their time. So, you know, it's oftentimes you'll run into some professors who kind of shrug off any questions that you ask. So don't do that to folks that are asking questions of you. All right, so now we're going to talk about a different type of presentation, and that's a poster presentation. So oftentimes, you know, in classes, we might be doing something where we're going through a PowerPoint, but if you're at some sort of conference or maybe an end of the semester department-wide type of thing, you might be doing something more like a poster presentation. So what that looks like is you take your research or your area of interest and you put all of the information on a large poster, you pin it up, you stand by it, and you wait for folks to come through and you share your knowledge and information with them. So this is a really different environment than a normal like PowerPoint presentation. And we're gonna go over some tips and tricks on how to handle those. So, as far as a fair style presentation, which is what I refer to these as, some things to keep in mind: you will have a varied audience, both in knowledge and in attention. So you might have folks coming through who are like experts in your field, who are super pumped about the info on your poster and who want to talk about it with you for quite a while and really dig into all the details. But you might also have folks who aren't necessarily experts in your field and are just kind of passing by to get to posters that are more in line with what they are knowledgeable on. So if you run by someone or if someone comes to your poster who doesn't seem that engaged with it, don't take it too personally. Chances are they're there for a subject that's slightly different from yours, but they're still trying to like interact with everyone there. So another thing to keep in mind, be prepared to repeat yourself. Because folks are coming by continuously, you're always getting a new audience, which means you're always going to have to start over, recover information, go back and forth between different like topics on your poster, and just repeat yourself a lot. So make sure that you have, you know, any materials that you bring with you, make sure you see those as really like good conversation starters, and then make sure to bring plenty. So you never know how many folks are going to stop by. You might also have people who want to take some of your materials with them to share with like the lab mates that they have back, you know, home or anything like that. So make sure you have quite a few of any materials that you're bringing with you. And then be prepared to answer really common questions. So after, you know, 5 or 10 minutes, or after a couple of people, you might notice that that people are asking the same question each time. So there are a couple of things that you can do. You can either be really prepared for that question, or you can start to incorporate some of that information into your general spiel that you're giving every time. And then the big thing about these poster presentations is that you want to focus on creating a dialogue. What's nice about them is that you can have a conversation and dive into the material a lot deeper and a lot more specifically than you might in a large scale like PowerPoint presentation format. So here's an example of a poster presentation that I gave. The bummer about some of these is that they have a lot of material on them. It's kind of the standard for these posters. I don't necessarily like it, but it's what everyone does, at least in my field. So some things to keep in mind is that you want to include some graphics, but make sure that they're easy to follow and easy to read. And then another thing is don't forget citations. So just like a paper or a PowerPoint presentation, you want to make sure to include your references. This is exceptionally true when someone's like, oh, I've never heard of that thing. What source did you pull that from? Where can I find more info on it? You can show them directly. And then also include your contact information in case folks want to reach out to you later about more information on your project. So I want to end with another example, and I want to end with an example that's more positive. So this is a presentation prompt that we used to give in our INTR 101 course. So folks used to have to give a presentation for their final, and that prompt was, for the final presentation, select a college success strategy featured in your action plan. In your presentation, address the following. How is the strategy useful? How have you changed or improved this strategy? And how would you talk about this strategy with others? So one other thing we included for folks is that they needed to have some sort of activity that they would do with the class. So obviously I'm going to show the activity, but we aren't necessarily going to do it all together. All right, so with that, let me give you a good example. Hi, and welcome. My name is Kelly Christensen, and I want to welcome you all to my presentation on critical reading for scientific articles. Scientific articles can be incredibly challenging to understand. They're often very dense and have a lot of content to them. So the question I asked myself is there a better way to read these papers and actually make them more understandable and easier to digest? And the answer was yes. And it's all about my favorite college success strategy, critical reading. So in order to better understand the article you're reading, you need to read with purpose, and you need to read in a different order. So that's the big thing. You don't have to read from the beginning to the end to understand the article, and you can really change up your order. So when you're reading a scientific article, the most important information tends to be located at the beginning and at the end. And we can get really lost in the details in between when we try and read straight through an article. Understanding the big picture first can then help us better understand the details later. So don't be afraid to read out of order. And this is the order that I came up that I think works best for reading scientific articles. First, read the abstract and introduction. It's going to give you the premise of the paper and the really big picture. Then jump to the end. Figure out what the punchline is, what the final conclusions were, because you're going to figure out what we're talking about and then what the researcher found. Next, pop back over to the background section and look at what the previous information was that went into the study. Then read the analysis and the methods to figure out how they did it all. And the reason this works so well is that if you know what they're trying to get to at the end, how they did it makes a lot more sense. So why is this a better method? Well, it contextualizes the experiments that you're trying to understand. Oftentimes when you read the methods or analysis section without any context for why they're doing the things they're doing, it just becomes really confusing. So understanding the endpoint of the experiment can help you understand the steps the researchers took to get there. Reading this way initially can also make a second read through a lot easier because you've been exposed to that material once, and now all of the details start to make a lot more sense. So we're going to try this out. I'm going to give you a paper, and for that provided paper, please find the main goal of the experiment, the major results, and the structure of the model, and do all of this in 5 minutes or less. All right, do any of you have any questions about the critical reading process when it comes to scientific articles? Okay, so for that presentation, my class then gave me some feedback on how it could be improved, what grade they would have given me, was it clear, all of those different things. So some questions that I asked them were, did the author cover all of the objectives for the prompt? Was the presentation professional, and what could have been better? For that one, folks gave me the general feedback that like, yeah, it was pretty clear, but we would have liked to have some more photos in it. Or some of your title slides were kind of long, like could you shorten them? So overall, we gave that presentation a B. But what's important is that was a lot more understandable than that first presentation I gave. It was really clear what the point was. I looked at the audience, I looked at the camera in this case, and made sure that folks were engaged and getting a lot from that presentation. And there weren't a lot of external distractions. So it was really easy for people to stay focused. So keep in mind that giving presentations requires a lot of practice. No one is like a perfect public speaker from day one, and it just takes a lot of hard work to get really good and to get really comfortable with that whole process. So keep that in mind for your next presentation. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.